Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. I will jump into things because, one of the reasons I ask for questions both on YouTube and on Facebook is because I get so in the weeds, it's hard for me to know what's on people's minds. And I would have told you, I'm on the road, and I would have told you from what I had read today that there really wasn't much in the news. And all of your questions, I'm like, oh, wow, that's right, that happened. Oh, wow, that too, that happened. Oh, wow. So I'm going to start you in a pretty dark place, and I'm going to end you in a pretty good place. At least that's my plan for the day. So I want to start, first of all, today with something truly grim, and that is the administration's rounding up and incarcerating undocumented immigrants. And just so you know, they're often taking US citizens as well, but then they end up moving the undocumented immigrants in first into processing places and then into long-term facilities. And those two things matter because what we know about the really bad conditions are primarily those of the processing places, which were not designed to house people for long periods of time. We all know almost nothing about the long-term facilities. And if you read me and listen to me, you know that I am beside myself over these things because we've had so little transparency as to what's happening in them, and also because one of the things that tended to fly under the radar screen was that the Trump administration changed the way the United States processed people who were scheduled for deportation. They did a couple of things. So, first of all, when Donald Trump ran for office in 2024, he kept talking about how he was going to get rid of criminals. And people like me and who'd been watching him before, and a lot of people said, wait a minute, be really careful here. Those of you who are thinking that means the rapists and murderers he kept talking about, because in his first term, his administration began to define anybody who was an undocumented immigrant as being a criminal. In fact, it's a misdemeanor to be in the US illegally. It's not a felony. But many people made the mistake of thinking he only meant violent criminals when in fact his people meant everybody. This is going to expand by far in the second term. But also, as part of it, one of the things that the administration has done is it has reinterpreted one of the ways in which people scheduled for deportation are being processed. So in the past, an undocumented immigrant could apply for to get out and have to come back, but would be out on bond. They would, they'd be processed and then they could put up a bond and then they would be able to leave the facility. Well, you can't do that anymore. Once you're in the hands of the US government, you stay in the hands of the US government until you are deported. And this is why the numbers of people who are incarcerated have gone through the roof under the Trump administration, and why they are being held in such terrible conditions, because a lot of the contracts for creating these new facilities are going to people. It looks pretty shady. They're going to people who don't necessarily have any history of major facilities, and some of the no bid contracts are going to people just under the limit that would trigger a requirement for there being open bidding on a government contract. There's been this really hasty expansion that is continuing. It's all over the news now, the administration's attempts to create these warehouses, these mega centers, as they're saying, that will hold between 5 and 10,000 people. I believe the current largest federal prison in the U.S. system holds 4,000 people. This is 5 to 10,000 people. And the idea is to have processing centers around the country and then send people to these warehouses from which they will eventually be deported. And this is hugely troubling. It is hugely problematic, both theoretically. We know that when you start to warehouse people like this, they are going to be abused, they are going to die. Even if they are not explicitly camps, they are not going to get the medical care that they need, and there is going to be disease through them. We also know, thanks to Judd Legum and his publication, Popular Information, he has traced down the fact that that ICE no longer provides backup medical care for detainees from the Veterans Administration the way it used to, because Tommy Tuberville, who's a Republican senator from Alabama, started to say that the government was stealing from veterans to help undocumented immigrants, even though that wasn't the case at all. ICE actually paid for the VA to be backup medical care. And so as a result, that ICE terminated that contract to have backup medical care from the VA. And as a result, the people who are currently incarcerated are not getting the medical care they need. So we have just theoretically this very bad idea of these warehouses for people, but then we also have the specifics of, if you create a for-profit system that warehouses human beings, you have to continue to find those human beings to put in those warehouses. It's one of the reasons I've had a really big problem with for-profit prisons for a very long time. I had a friend who was in a for-profit prison, and I just can't even begin to list it for you all the ways in which they are truly horrific things. But one of the things about them is, in order to make a good profit on them, you want to keep them full all the time, which means you want to keep people in prison. And if you don't have people in prison, you want to find more people to put in there. So this expansion of our prison system, and then the financing to make that happen, so that people are indebted to that system, is something that has historians' hair on fire because of the implications of that. So that's the place I wanted to start today, because you asked about why we had so many more people in detention than we've had in the past. They can't get out on bond any longer, and what's going on with those warehouses. So you're seeing enormous pushback across the country against those warehouses. But as there is more pushback against what's happening with the federal agents from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and from Border Patrol, which are both under the Department of Homeland Security, I think you're able to start to see a real division in the administration. So let's just start there with the Department of Homeland Security, where the secretary is Kristi Noem, the former governor of South Dakota, and she works closely with an advisor named Corey Lewandowski, who is not elected. He's an advisor. They are working very closely with Stephen Miller, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and of course, Greg Bovino, who was running Border Patrol in Minneapolis. And now we've got, I'm not going to say about him, he's a little bit of a different faction, but they are all motivated apparently by what is called the Great Replacement theory. And the Great Replacement theory has deep roots in American society, but it's taking its modern moniker, if you will, from a recent book coming out of France that argues that people of color, especially Muslims, because France had a big influx of Muslim immigrants, people of color coming into primarily white countries are destroying what they call civilization of those countries and ruining who they are. And you can see this belief in the Great Replacement theory in Stephen Miller's frequent use of the word invasion. And you see Donald Trump doing the same thing, and you see Vice President J.D. Vance doing the same thing. So when Donald Trump, for example, told the UN early in this year, I think within the last few months, that Europe was being destroyed, and you got to stop open borders. He kept talking about open borders. He is really talking about this idea that old cultures are being taken over by people of color, and they're going to destroy those cultures. Now, he talked the same way in the US when he kept insisting, and still insists, that Joe Biden had open borders. there were never open borders in the US. There have always been rules about coming in. Biden had to contend with fallout from COVID, where the US economy improved better than any other economy on the globe, at the same time that a number of Latin American countries, primarily Venezuela, but others as well, were really kind of falling apart economically. And that's what created that enormous surge to the border, which had begun to stop by the time Biden was was coming toward the end of his term, and the economy was starting to pick up in Latin American countries. There was never an open border, but that's that language that Trump and JD Vance and Miller and their ilk use. So you can see these people who are absolutely determined to get rid of Black and brown people from the United States, and at the same time create a system of violence against those people, of incarceration of those people, and of expulsion of those people. And to that end, you're seeing, I just talked about the warehouses and all that, but you're also seeing on the Hill today in front of Congress a number of officials from ICE, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Now, just to be clear, people get this confused all the time. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is like up here. It's above Border Patrol. Border Patrol is a piece of the sort of really violent piece of that. And people use them interchangeably at the same way we call them all ICE, but they're not all ICE. The ICE and Border Patrol are different groups. They're both federal agents. That's why I was right about federal agents. But Border Patrol, especially under Greg Bovino, has tended to get very, very violent. Anyway, so the head of Customs and Border Protection was at the Hill, and so was one other, the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They were testifying before the House Homeland Security Committee today, and it was really interesting because the Democrats, of course, are all over, you're killing people, you're picking up U.S. citizens, you're zip tying children, which is another story that came out today. You're hurting all these people. And at the same time, the officials kept saying that, in fact, the real victims of this system are the federal agents. They say that protesters are endangering the lives of the federal agents, which is just such astonishing gaslighting and what we would call DARVO, the reversing of victim and offender. The thing about the Minneapolis protests is they have been nonviolent, and I'm going to talk more about them in a little bit. But the real violence is coming from Border Patrol and to some degree from ICE as well. So they doubled down on supporting what's happening at the same time that Republicans in the House tended to support them, while Democrats are saying, this is wackadoodle. You can't do this stuff. You're hurting the Constitution and all that. The Republicans in the House supported them. So you're starting to see, a real split there in between Republicans and Democrats in the House over the violence of Border Patrol. So that is out there with the idea of these guys who are just anti-brown and black and brown people. I mean, they like the violence, they like the hurting and all that. But I'm going to suggest that Trump is in a different place. I mean, he's fine with that too. He's happy to parrot the Great Replacement stuff. He's always been a racist. This is nothing new from him. You can go all the way back to his childhood, for God's sake, but you can stop and look at the way he talked about the men who were known as the Central Park Five in, I think it was the 80s, who were later completely cleared of the violence of which they had been accused. And he still said, nonetheless, you should go after them, even though they've been found not guilty. But that's a rabbit hole. I won't go down there. But so Trump is falling apart. I mean, one of the things that shows up in the Epstein files is a conversation, an email between Epstein and somebody talking about having seen Trump in 2017 and being concerned about his mental health then, thinking he had dementia then. But you can just tell the man is in real trouble now. He can't really think about a lot of stuff. And what that has done is it has stripped out all the dissembling, all the veneer that he used to put over some of his beliefs to make it look like it was more palatable. And it seems pretty clear that what he is trying to do right now in his administration is simply make as much money as it is humanly possible to make. He cares about money. This is the most corrupt administration in American history by far. A lot of you asked about that, and I'm going to say a bit more about pushing on that. But that also ties in some of the questions you asked about. So, first of all, the bridge between Canada and Michigan that he is now saying, even though he approved it and was proud of it in his first term, now he is saying Canada can't do this. Um, it seems pretty likely if you look at the way he has handled tariffs and if you look at these threats that he's making, it seems pretty clear he's making a big threat. You can't have this bridge or whatever, although it's not at all clear what he can do about the bridge. And he's hoping to get some kind of a payoff for it, and you can see this again and again and again. And my favorite example of this is Vietnam. He really put the screws to Vietnam over tariffs, and all of a sudden the tariffs went back down to about where they had been. He backed way off on them. Well, why did he do that? All of a sudden, the Vietnamese government fast-tracked his ability to create some golf course resort areas in Vietnam, and really basically just took over a whole bunch of land and stuff that he couldn't have gotten through otherwise. But he used the power of us. He used the power of the American people and our economic might to force the Vietnamese government to cough up something that he could profit from. And you see this in everything that he has done. So he's really focusing on making money. And there, you also asked about the ballroom and what's happening with the ballroom. This is really interesting because you're starting to see pushback on a number of these things, including that ballroom. So there was a lawsuit about the ballroom from the National Historic Trust for Preservation. I've got those words mixed up. Anyway, the people who are have a charter to protect American historical artifacts. I wrote about that a number of weeks ago. If you're interested, you can Google it and it'll come up, and who they are and how they're funded and all that. But they sued and said, nobody can just freaking tear down part of the White House. That's just not the way this works. And of course, the administration has argued that, well, by law, it has to consult with a board about building, that you don't have to consult about tearing down, which is, completely made up, right? So they have sued. And part of what has happened with that lawsuit is the funding of that ballroom has become clear. And, I was always crazy suspicious of this because people were pouring money into that ballroom and it kept getting more and more expensive until finally some architect, and you can read this in the architectural magazines that are talking about this stuff, said, this is so incredibly expensive. There's no way that this money can all be going into this ballroom. And what we have learned is that the money is going into what is technically a not-for-profit, a nonprofit. And they are taking fees out of that money. And we don't know anything about that yet. I'm sure it will continue. I'm sorry. I don't know anything about that yet. I'm sure it will continue to come out and we will learn more. But I have always been absolutely fascinated by so many of these right-wing organizations that have a long history, by the way. This goes all the way back to World War II and probably before that. But they really take off after World War II with the rise of anti-communism in the US, where somebody would say, and I'm making this up, but it's not far from the truth, communists are trying to take over the junior highs in this country, and I know how they're doing it, and I can stop it if you just give money to my organization. And I've always wondered just how big a business these kind of grifts are, because you see them all around you in the radical right. And you certainly see it with Donald Trump, who's constantly saying, I need to raise money to challenge this. I need to raise money to do this. And the money really never shows up, because what happens is the people who are organizing those things take a lot of money as overhead and as salary. which is what Hegseth did with the small veterans organization he was supposed to be running, right? He ended up taking a ton of money out of it for his own use or the use of his family or whatever it was. I don't remember the details of it. But my guess is we're going to discover that the ballroom was a way for major corporations to funnel more money to Trump. That this was, yeah, maybe they were going to throw up something, but the bigger it got and the grander it got, the more money was going to end up in Trump's pockets. That's my guess. So you can see him sort of hunkering down and trying to grab as much money as he possibly can. And I think I talked about it here, the fact that immediately before he took office, one of the leaders of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, bought about a 49% stake in World Liberty Financial, which was the Trump's cryptocurrency coin, and that put about $187 million directly into Trump's pocket and about $31 million into the pockets of the Witkoff family, because the Witkoff's sons and the Trump sons created the World Liberty Financial together. So you're seeing more and more of this corruption starting to bubble up. And people don't like corruption, by the way. That's something that's a real that's a real political albatross. That is a rabbit hole I'm going to go down, because nobody ever remembers that the idea of having an albatross around your neck, what that means. That's from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is this old epic poem in which a mariner shoots an albatross, and albatrosses are supposed to be good luck. And so the minute he shoots the albatross, or shortly after he shoots the albatross, the boat gets stuck in the doldrums. Remember, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. That's from that as well. And to punish him and to try to sort of appease the gods, they tie the albatross around his neck, where it rots. And so that's, having an albatross around your neck, that's where that comes from. All right. So the other thing that is happening right now, if I started off with this attempt to create a system, an economic and a political system that is incarcerating and punishing many, 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 many people, including people who are in the U.S. legally, by the way. They're trying to turn people illegally into undocumented immigrants by getting away things like temporary protected status and so on. But if that's one of the aims of the people who are white nationalists, and Trump's out for money, there is a real haste here because things seem to be starting to fall apart. Now, of course, I always think they're falling apart because I can't believe we are where we are. But there are things that are catching on in the American electorate. And the first of those is the Epstein files. Now, the Epstein files, as you know, are something that Trump got elected on. He promised that he was gonna let the Epstein files out. And one of the reasons everybody asks, why didn't the Biden people do it? Well, first of all, you're not actually supposed to leak stuff to hurt your enemies. But second of all, if you remember, the Biden administration, the Department of Justice under Biden, prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell. So that was an ongoing case that you're not supposed to talk about, an ongoing case from the Department of Justice. So Trump said he was going to let that information out. And of course, once it became clear that he was all over the Epstein files, he has said that wasn't going to happen. So the Congress on November 19th passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act that required, it wasn't a suggestion, it required the Department of Justice to release all of the Epstein files. And those are the files that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, collected in their investigation of Epstein. That is different than the files that have come from the Epstein estate, some of which the executors of the estate have released, which is why there was stuff that came out over the course of the summer, including that birthday card, for example. That was from the Epstein estate. The Epstein investigation files, the Epstein files that we're talking about here, the Congress said to the Department of Justice, you got to let these things out. And if you remember when Attorney General Pam Bondi first took office, she said, I'm reviewing these files right now. They're on my desk. And then in July, they came forward and said, oh, there's nothing in there. There's no, and they're very careful about the way they speak. She said, there's no list of men. Well, that doesn't say there's no names in letters. And if you parse the way this administration talks, they pull that all the freaking time. Similarly, which I won't talk about today, when you think about the way they talk about surveillance, and they have been asked repeatedly, are you putting names in a DHS database? And they say, oh, no, we are not. We are not putting names in a DHS database, which, I mean, you don't even have to be good at this to figure out what they're saying. They're saying we're putting them in a different database. And you know, this is something they were doing with that FBI thing. So with the Epstein files. So with the fact that Attorney General Pam Bondi came out and said, we're not going to let anything out because there's nothing there. There was enough of an outcry, not just among the Democrats, but among Republicans. And that was why the Epstein files broke through, is because MAGA cared about that. And so on November 19th, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which required the Department of Justice to turn those suckers over to the public. And it's very specific. You can Google the law. It's very, very short. It's less than a page long. So like an appropriations bill, you know, God help you, because it goes on forever. But if you Google that, and what you do is you can Google Epstein Files Transparency Act, that's the name of it, comma, text. That's how that will come up. There are other ways to get to it too, but that should come up very easily. You will see they're very specific about what needs to be released, that is everything, and what can be redacted, which is only the names and identifying information about survivors. That's not supposed to be businessmen. Anything else is supposed to come out. And then the Department of Justice was supposed to, I think it was within 2 weeks, release a statement of why they had done each redaction they had done. Well, of course, they never released the files. They just were like, we can, you know, and when they finally did release things, they were so heavily redacted that they don't tell you a lot of stuff. So those files have been creeping out, and now the Department of Justice maintains it's released about half of them, but it's not going to release the other half because it says they're redundant, or because there's, you know, they're corrupted. There's all sorts of reasons that they have for that. But as of yesterday, February 9th, the Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said, well, you know, if Congress really wants to see these files, they can see it without redactions. And Jamie Raskin, who's on the House Judiciary Committee, he's a representative from Maryland, and he's a constitutional lawyer. He jumped all over that. He wrote the next day. Blanche said that on a Friday. Raskin wrote on a Saturday and said, okay, I want to see him, and I can see him tomorrow. So the Department of Justice said as of yesterday, Monday, they would let lawmakers come in to sit at one of 4 computer terminals and look through the files that existed without redactions. Well, that's about 3 million pages, which is a huge, huge amount of information. And I think probably what they're trying to do is hide stuff in a file of stuff. So, for example, if I had 4 pieces of paper that you wanted to look at, I could just say, I'm not going to give it to you, and you can't see it. And then you would fight for those 4 pieces of paper. Or if I had 4 pieces of paper that you wanted to see, I could say, sure, I'd be happy to give you everything I've got. I've got 40 million pieces of paper, or even 4 million pieces of paper. You can see it all. And then you got to find those 4 pieces of paper. And that's pretty common. It's a pretty common way to hide information, is to give you too much information. That's what the news does to us now. It's what this whole, I've talked about that before. So a number of lawmakers, primarily Democrats, but also Thomas Massie, who's a Republican of Kentucky and has been absolutely on this, and also Lauren Boebert, a Republican of Colorado, went to look at these files. And what they found, among other things, was that, as Jamie Raskin said, a simple word search, and I suspect word search is, by the way, he says that Donald Trump's name appears just in that first half, because the Department of Justice has not made that second half of the files available even to members of Congress. But just in that first half, he says Trump's name appears more than 1 million times. That's a problem. So that is not going to go away, because one of the things that's in it is how many powerful Americans or powerful people associated with the American government are in those files. One of those people is Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who maintained that he had not that he had met Epstein in 2005 and was so disgusted by a visit to his house that he cut all ties with him. In fact, Lutnick lived next to Epstein for at least 10 years, and the Epstein files have shown that he was in business with Epstein until at least 2018, which is the year before, I think it was, Epstein died in his jail cell, but many years after he had already been convicted of sex trafficking. I think it was sex trafficking. Sexual assault or sex trafficking. I'm sorry, I do these all from the top of my head, so sometimes I trip up on things like that. So Lutnick's in trouble on both sides. Even the Republicans just kind of want him to go away because he doesn't add much to the department anyway. He just shows up on TV and it is rah, rah Trump. And, I think they just as soon toss him overboard. So we'll see what happens to him. But, another person who's all over those files is Elon Musk. And Elon, that's another issue that I'm not going to go into at great length right now, because there's other stuff I want to get to. But Ro Khanna, who's a Democrat of California, came out today and said, even what they're showing us is still redacted. It was not supposed to be redacted. And just a reminder, Congress speaks for us. I mean, these are our representatives that are supposed to be seeing this. And there's a law saying they're supposed to be seeing it. And the Department of Justice is saying no. And that's going to continue to come out, not least because it's all over Europe. And in Europe, heads are rolling over contact with Epstein that are showing up in the American files. So, for example, the former United Kingdom ambassador to Washington, a man named Peter Mandelson, was fired, and he has created such a crisis. It looked for a bit as if it was going to bring down the British Prime Minister for having appointed him. Two senior Norwegian diplomats, one of whom had to resign on Sunday from a position as an ambassador to Jordan and to Iraq, and she and a male partner are under investigation in Norway for gross corruption. The National Security Advisor in Slovakia has resigned after messages appeared between him and Epstein about Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, whom you've heard about in the US as well. And Poland, here's the biggie. I mean, they're all big, but Poland has announced that it is launching an investigation into whether or not Epstein was tied to Russian intelligence. And I'm going to quote for you from his statement, from the Prime Minister's statement, in which he said, more and more leads, more and more information, and more commentary in the global press all relate to the suspicion that this unprecedented pedophilia scandal was co-organized by Russian intelligence services. I don't need to tell you how serious the increasingly likely possibility that Russian intelligence services co-organized this operation is for the security of the Polish state. This can only mean that they also possess compromising materials against many leaders still active today. And that's interesting because the one head that has rolled in the US so far is Brad Karp, who was a senior partner at Paul Weiss, which was one of the Wall Street law firms. Paul Weiss was the first one that caved to Trump's demands back in March. And it turns out that that Karp was not only in the Epstein files, but that today news came that he and Epstein had tried to get a woman framed for or accused of a crime so they could get her deported. So you kind of wonder what else is there. So things seem to be, to some degree, beginning to collapse around Epstein, you also have Ghislaine Maxwell, who has took the fifth today when I think it was today when talking, saying she has told Congress that she would tell everything she knows. The woman is a pathological liar, so that's a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. But she says she'll tell everything she knows so long as she gets a full pardon. She, of course, will basically spend the rest of her life in prison for her work sex trafficking children to Epstein. So there's that out there as well. Now, you asked about what's going on with the Clintons and what do I expect the Clintons are going to come up with. And the answer to that, I don't know, I don't predict the future. I doubt there's much that they have that they can contribute. Maybe, who knows? But the reason that that's significant is overwhelmingly because you can tell that James Comer, who is just dumber than a haddock, right, is hoping that he's going to get some kind of a quotations out of Hillary Clinton that he can throw on Fox News because it worked 10 years ago. And maybe something from Bill Clinton. But let me tell you, Hillary Clinton is crazy smart. And Bill Clinton is as well. My guess is that it's not going to be possible for Comer to get them to say anything that they don't want to say, and it's funny because it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I'll give it to you anyway. They did work with the committee for many months. They gave private depositions that were recorded, the whole thing. And Comer, of course, just, I don't know, Comer, well, whatever. But finally, Comer kept moving the goalposts. And finally, it's worth finding, they wrote him a letter. And basically in the letter, they said, and I am paraphrasing for you. They basically said, dude, we are so much smarter than you. Don't do this. You're going to regret it. But of course, Comer walked right into it and insisted that they testify publicly. Now he's backing way off on that. He wanted to testify. They said, we're going to do it publicly. Now he's backing off. He doesn't want that to happen. But he made a mistake in that he really thought that they would not agree to testify. And when they agreed to testify, now it's a whole different kettle of fish, because there has never been the precedent that a former president has to testify before Congress. They have done so on occasion, but not under subpoena and not under threat of criminal prosecution. Now Comer has established that. And the minute the Democrats get into control in the House and the Senate, they are 100% going to start calling Trump and Trump people. And you can see Comer sort of being like a deer in the headlights, like, oops, I didn't mean to do that. But I promise you the Democrats aren't going to forget that. So if you're expecting something exciting from that, maybe. I mean, I'm not, I don't know. Hillary Clinton testified for more than 11 hours over Benghazi, and never, there was nothing there that hadn't already been released in the papers. So I'd be very surprised if there's more. All right. So let me see. What else did you want here? Got the ballroom, warehouses, Epstein, the bridge. The whistleblower that you asked about. I can't tell you a lot about the whistleblower because all we know, and this is absolutely top secret, and I'm following this incredibly closely. All we know, and we know this from a report in The Guardian, there have been a number of big reports, but it appears to be that back in March or April of 2025, the National Security Agency intercepted 2 foreign agents talking about somebody who was close to Trump and talking about a foreign country that allegedly is Iran. Now, immediately after that, you may or may not remember this, but there was a huge sweep of firings at the NSA that there was a huge outcry over. The top two people at the NSA, the National Security Agency, were fired. They were very well regarded, and that included somebody who ran cybersecurity. And everyone was like, what are you doing and why are you doing this? Well, maybe now we know, maybe not. Maybe it wasn't related. But that's all we know. We know that a whistleblower came forward in May, and Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, bottled it up. So the Congress didn't hear about it until November, and now they finally, the Gang of Eight, which is the top four members of each of both chambers of Congress, both the Republicans and the Democrats. So two top senators, Republican, Democrat, two top House members, the Speaker and the Minority Leader, and the same for the intelligence committees. They have seen it, but they have seen such a redacted version of it that the Republicans have said, oh, it's fine. But the Democrats have said, how do you know it's fine? Because you couldn't see what it was about. So they're and they redacted it under the argument of executive privilege, which suggests that Trump is involved. Of course, who knows with this administration, but that's all we know right now. And my guess is we won't know a lot more for a while. There are going to be big fights over this. And I would just caution you, I mean, I'm so suspicious of anything this administration does, but we just do not know what's in it. So I can't tell you any more about that. And I just interviewed Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, who's all over this stuff. And he's the one who wrote the letter basically to the American people, to the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, saying, I want to call your attention to the classified letter I wrote you. And I'm about things that the CIA is doing that I think are really, really bad. I'm paraphrasing that. He put it much better than that. I interviewed him, and everyone said to me, ask him about it. And I actually did ask staffers if they had any more information. And they said, you're welcome to ask him, but I promise you he's not going to tell you anything because he's on the Intelligence Committee. And that there's just no way they're going to let anything else out. And I had so little time with them, I wasn't going to waste time on that. So when we see it, I don't know how it's going to come out, but it's probably going to be somewhat like the whistleblower that got us the telephone call about Trump trying to extort Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019 to smear Hunter Biden in order to weaken Joe Biden before the 2020 election. All right, I think that's everything that you asked about. That kind of what I'm trying to set up here is that there's a really bad thing going on. With the detention centers. There seems to be crumbling with the Epstein files, for example, and with the FBI raid on Fulton County, Georgia. We now have seen, as of today, the sign off on why they were allowed to do that, and the affidavit about where there was supposed to be some kind of law being broken there was one of Trump's conspiracy theorists. So it was bonkers. You're also starting to see things crumble a bit in the fact that Trump disinvited two Democratic governors from the traditional governor's dinner at the White House. And when he did that, he disinvited Jared Polis of Colorado, whom he is mad at because he wants him to pardon Tina Peters, who's somebody who tried to flip the election in 2020 for him. And he disinvited Wes Moore, probably because Wes Moore is black. Certainly that's what Wes Moore said anyway. And when he did that, the other Democratic governors said, we're not going. And if you remember, it was the Democratic governor, it was the governor's dinner. They have a business meeting and then they have dinner. And it was at the dinner last year that Maine Governor Janet Mills told Trump she'd see him in court. So the Democratic governors said, we're not going to go if you're not going to invite all of us. And the Republican governors have now said, we're not going to go if you're not having the Democrats. And that's really interesting because the governors are really not the same kettle of fish as the federal electeds because they have to work together. They have to be there to help each other out. And for all that some of them are, virulent on the right, there really aren't that many virulent Democrats. for the most part, they try to work together simply because they need to. And so it was interesting that the Republican governors said to Trump, "You can't pull this. We're not gonna abandon our Democratic colleagues." And that was that was a really important moment. All right, so at the same time that's starting to crumble, I also wanted to push forward a little bit with some of the things that may or may not be going right. So Trump recognizes that his popularity has hit new lows as of today. There are job numbers coming out tomorrow that the administration is backing off of madly, saying, well, remember, we told you we were going to take a while to make everything boom again, which has lots of us suspicious those job numbers are going to be bad. But they're also suddenly trying to push through the SAVE Act, which would require, they're messing around with it. So I hate to tell you everything that's in it because they keep changing it. But basically, it's an attempt to throw a lot of primarily women off of the voting rolls by forcing you to produce a birth certificate or a passport in order to register to vote. The one of the versions you have to produce it in order to vote as well. It would also require states to hand over their voting rolls to the federal government, and this is very clearly an attempt to rig the 2026 elections. And I wish I could talk more about what those elections look like, but I've already run way over. But they recognize that they're in real trouble. Now, why is that the case? A number of things are suggesting that the American people are stepping up to the plate. And I want to start. People keep saying I'm not mentioning the monks who have just arrived in Washington, D.C. today. I've actually talked about them a number of times, and I'm going to talk about them again. They're not real. They are making the news. People keep saying no one's talking about them. They do. They're in the papers every day. They're not garnering the kind of attention that Trump's antics do, but they're very important because what they are doing is they are arguing not arguing because they're monks, they are demonstrating that peace, as they say, is not a destination. That rather than the strife that we are seeing around us, people have to find peace in themselves and bring that then to their communities and to their country. And that message and the attention that it has gotten around on this 2,300-mile walk, I think it's been, from Texas to Washington, D.C., through this bitter cold, by the way, and a couple of terrible accidents, has resonated with Americans. And it has resonated with Americans because of the monks, but also, I think, because of what's happening in Minnesota. And around the country elsewhere, but we're really seeing it in Minnesota, where people are successfully resisting federal agents who are violent, who are trying to whip up opposition, that are trying to give Trump an excuse for calling out the Insurrection Act, or for invoking the Insurrection Act and calling up troops. And what people in Minnesota have demonstrated is the extraordinary power of taking care of each other, of being neighbors. Of you from the first I started doing these, people would say to me, what can I do? And the answer, of course, from a politician is to vote and to give money to causes. But one of the things a lot of us have emphasized is things that bring you joy, is whatever you have, bring it. And we could say those things, but you couldn't necessarily see how being able to draw letters, for example, was a skill that anybody could need. Well, now that you see people standing out with signs, you get that those skills really matter, right? And what we've seen in Minnesota is people taking care of each other and their skills at driving a car so that people don't have to go to the supermarket, or walking children to school, or cooking, or covering for someone's shift at work so they don't get picked up. Like all the things that we do to take care of each other in communities turn out to be exactly what has weakened the federal agents and this attempt to militarize the United States and turn it into a fascist state. And that, of course, we know from literature. We certainly know it from films. You think of Gandalf talking about how the hobbits are the ones who are going to be able to bring down Sauron because they're the ones who have those homely values. We are literally seeing that happen in Minnesota. And that is important for this moment. It also ties deeply into American history, not least because so much of it is driven by women. And you can see the radical right not being able to fathom that this is community driven, because they don't know what it means for people to volunteer their time in a community and to help each other out with their kids or with groceries or with all the things that communities, and especially women, have always done that they didn't pay attention to. And now we're seeing the quiet, extraordinary power of that. And that, I think that ties into the monks. I think it ties into Minneapolis. I think it ties into what is happening around the country right now in this attempt to resist Donald Trump and the people in his administration who are fighting for this great replacement theory and who are trying to create a fascist state. And this is still very much on the table. This spring is going to be bad. I've said that all along. It's getting worse every day. People are incarcerated in ways that we don't know, and people are dying. Somebody said to me, when, do you think people are going to start dying? And I'm like, boy, has that ship sailed. This is going to get worse. But we are starting to see our power, and that our power lies not in screaming and competing with Trump in that way, but in the power of taking care of each other. And that is something that we can all do, and that we now can see is extraordinarily powerful. So going forward in this moment, that remains powerful, but there are more and more specific things that you can do. So everybody I talk to, every elected I talk to, I always say, what can people do? And they all say, use your voice. They all say that when you pressure somebody, when you call a Republican and you call your Congress people or you call your local officials and you say, I don't want X to happen, people back off. And you can see this with the meetings against these giant warehouses. You can see these with protests against federal agents in ICE and Border Patrol. You can see this with the budget, which, by the way, Trump, it's still, the government is still controlled by Republicans. It is still controlled by Republicans. But the budget that Trump put forward in 2026 has been completely ignored, and the Democrats have managed to push the Republicans to restore not all, but much of the money that Trump and the Department of Justice had the Department of Government Efficiency had stripped out of the budget. That's because people spoke up. So in this moment, continue to speak up, not just about those concentration camps, which again, I think when we find out what was going on in those, we're going to be beside ourselves. And that's me speaking as a historian, by the way. This is why I'm like, my hair's on fire over them, but also over the SAVE Act, which is a desperate attempt of the Republicans to steal the 2026 election, and also over things like Citizens United, the idea that unlimited money can pour into our system to pervert our democracy. And you're already seeing Elon Musk, for example, pouring money into the 2026 elections. The Republicans are sitting on an enormous, what they call war chest. They have far more money than the Democrats. And this idea that people can simply buy their government is one that must end, because if we could get the money, that extraordinary money, out of politics, then we would get the things that I care about, like having a fairer tax code so that people who have a lot of money paid higher taxes. All those things that are down the chain would flow out of protecting the vote, getting rid of money in politics. And from there, we can also go with nonpartisan gerrymandering, getting rid of partisan gerrymandering, not the other way around, And the reforms that were the first things that the Democrats put on the table back in 2021, but they couldn't pass because of the Senate filibuster, that we as Americans ought to support. And by the way, that is not a partisan stance. Both Republicans, Democrats, and independents, who make up a bigger bloc now than either the Democrats or the Republicans, want to end partisan gerrymandering, want to get money out of politics, and want to have free and fair elections. So putting our weight in things like that going forward into 2026 is going to be enormously important. And we know it works. So for all that I started you in a terrible place today, I hope I am leaving you with a sense that after preaching for a year about how what you are doing matters, that you can now see that what you are doing matters. And even if it may not feel like it's heroic to walk somebody else's kid home from school so that the parents stay safe, it is heroic, because that's the way we protect our families, that's the way we protect our communities, and that's the way ultimately that we will protect our democracy. So I hope that gives you a little bit of hope going forward. I went on way too long today because I thought I had nothing to talk about, but then there were so many things you wanted me to cover. I tried to get them all. My notes are done. So at least I got all of those things done. Thanks for being here. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend, about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.